Alright everybody, and we are back. And we are now officially in the home stretch, just 4 teams to go, including today's team, the Seattle Seahawks. So back-to-back teams here in the NFC West, and definitely an exciting team to talk about with Seattle, because looking at the history here during the Pete Carroll era starting in 2010, they've made the playoffs 10 out of these 13 seasons, never once having fewer than 7 victories, including, of course, a Super Bowl victory in Super Bowl 48 following the 2013 season, as well as a Super Bowl loss, of course, in Super Bowl 49 the following season. And Seattle hasn't had a playoff victory since 2019 over the Philadelphia Eagles, but they have made the playoffs 2 out of the last 3 seasons, including last year when, really after trading Russell Wilson following the 2021 season, many of the so-called experts and fans were saying that the Seattle Seahawks were going to miss the playoffs in 2022. They were going to be one of the worst teams. So let's see what happened here where Seattle was able to maintain a winning record and actually make the postseason. So looking at this 2022 Seahawks roster, of course they do go 9-8 as we mentioned under head coach Pete Carroll. And as we also mentioned, Russell Wilson no longer in the fold. So they hand the keys to Geno Smith, and let's look at their rankings league-wide here on offense and defense. So this offense was an above-average unit and was definitely the driving force of this team's success. They were ranked 9th in terms of points scored, 13th in terms of yards accumulated, and they were 4th in terms of passing touchdowns. So only 3 teams threw more passing touchdowns last year than the Seattle Seahawks. And I don't have that stat in front of me who 1 through 3 are, but I believe they were the Kansas City Chiefs, Cincinnati Bengals, and Buffalo Bills. So the only quarterbacks to throw more touchdowns last year than Geno Smith were Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Joe Burrow. Very impressive stuff there. Then looking at this defense, definitely one of the worst units in the league last year. I won't say the worst, I mean, definitely bottom 10, I guess I should say. So they rank 25th in terms of points allowed, 26th in terms of yards allowed, but they do generate the 5th most forced fumbles, 9th in the league in turnovers, so bit of a silver lining there, even though they are allowing teams to run up and down the field on them. They are turning the ball over and allowing Geno Smith to get possession once again with a short field. So let's see what happened in this 2022 schedule because it's definitely a bit of a roller coaster of a season for the Seahawks. So initially things don't start off fantastic. They defeat Russell Wilson though in week 1 in a thrilling 1-point victory before losing by 20 points to the San Francisco 49ers in week 2. They lose by 4 to the Atlanta Falcons in week 3. They win a thrilling 48-45 victory over the Detroit Lions in week 4, then lose 39-32 over the New Orleans Saints in week 5. So now after week 5, they're 2-3. This is kind of what people expected going into the season. Maybe this win over Denver was seen as a bit of a fluke because, well, they just got up for that game because it was Russell Wilson and they wanted to really stick it to him. But then they also have this victory over Detroit, and it was a 48-45 victory. Detroit had the worst defense in the league last year, so even after week 5 here at 2-3, still not a lot of believers in the Seattle Seahawks roster. However, they do go on a 4-game winning streak coming out of week 5 against the Arizona Cardinals, Los Angeles Chargers, New York Giants, and Arizona Cardinals once again. And keep in mind, this was when Kyler Murray was still in the lineup for the Arizona Cardinals, so it's not like we're talking about this 2023 Arizona Cardinals roster with Joshua Dobbs off of the waiver wire starting at quarterback for them. This was a Cardinals team that honestly had higher expectations than the Seahawks last year, and Seattle's able to defeat them twice in the span of less than a month. But in between, they actually defeat 2 playoff teams, well, eventual playoff teams as well. The Los Angeles Chargers they defeat by 2 touchdowns of a score of 37-23, And same thing with the New York Giants. They defeat by a 2-touchdown score of 27-13. So definitely an impressive run here by the Seattle Seahawks, where they position themselves heading into a London game here against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers right before the bye week, where they do end up losing by one score, 21-16, but heading into their Week 11 bye week, they're sitting with a 6-4 record, so not too shabby. Then coming out of the bye week, they do lose 4 of their next 5, including an overtime loss right away to the Raiders. They are able to defeat the Los Angeles Rams, though, by one score before losing to the Carolina Panthers, San Francisco 49ers, and Kansas City Chiefs back to back to back. Definitely a tough stretch there against the 49ers and the Chiefs back to back, but definitely not doing them any favors losing to the Carolina Panthers and Las Vegas Raiders. That being said, though, even though on Christmas Eve here, after losing to the Chiefs, they're sitting at 7-8, they're still alive in the playoff picture, and they finished strong, winning their last 2 games against the New York Jets and in Week 18 against the Los Angeles Rams in overtime to send them to the NFC playoffs. And they defeat Los Angeles. Seattle ends up going 4-2 in the NFC West, sweeping both the Arizona Cardinals and Los Angeles Rams. Very impressive considering both of those teams had considerably higher expectations entering 2022 than Seattle did. Honestly, out of this division, Seattle had by far the lowest expectations entering 2022. Really nothing was expected out of them, but the Rams were the reigning Super Bowl champions. They defeat them both matchups. And the Arizona Cardinals, as we mentioned, they had Kyler Murray at quarterback still. They were a playoff team in 2021. Even though they weren't necessarily expected to be a lock to make the 2022 playoffs, they were considered more of a contender than the Seahawks. So defeating them twice in the span of under a month, very impressive. But the final team in the division, the San Francisco 49ers, they do not fare as well against. They lose both of their regular season matchups to the 49ers, then get the liberty of facing them once again in Santa Clara during the wild card round, and while it was close for a little while, the 49ers just pull away in the second half, win 41-23. So looking now at the individual stats for Seattle, and Geno Smith, as we mentioned, very impressive season, starts all 17 games and actually wins Comeback Player of the Year because of this. Even though he didn't necessarily come back from an injury, he came back from a lack of opportunity. He was a journeyman quarterback, bouncing around the league for a while as a backup after being, I wouldn't say labeled a bust because he was a second round pick of the New York Jets, but back when he played with the Jets, they did originally try to work him into that starting role, and it just didn't work out. So he bounced around to a few teams, the Chargers, the Giants, and eventually was Russell Wilson's backup in Seattle for many years. But once the Seahawks move on from Russell Wilson, the idea was that they were going to draft perhaps a younger quarterback, but no, they just had Geno Smith step right into the role, and he thrives here. In fact, he had a much better season than Russell Wilson did last season. Those for nearly 4,300 yards, and all 17 games started for 30 touchdowns to just 11 interceptions. You will take that any day of the week as your starting quarterback. That is a very impressive stat line, but especially for somebody of Geno Smith's pedigree who wasn't considered really even a starting caliber quarterback entering 2022. So props to Geno for sticking with it and really showing why he belongs in the National Football League. Then looking at the rushing and receiving stats here, Kenneth Walker III steps in as a rookie right onto the field and absolutely produces. He appears in 15 games, starts 11 of them, and finishes with over 1,000 rushing yards and 9 rushing touchdowns to another 27 receptions and 165 receiving yards. So only can go up really for Kenneth Walker here. I mean, I guess it could certainly go down. He had a really strong campaign, but as a rookie, that's as good a place to start as any. That's probably a better way to put it. But looking at the receivers, dynamic duo of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett at it yet again. Both of these guys crossing the 1,000-yard threshold. DK Metcalf starting all 17 games, Tyler Lockett missing just one game. Metcalf with 6 touchdowns, Lockett with 9. Very nice stuff all around. And no other receiver actually crosses the 500-yard threshold, but when you have those two at the top, that's to be expected. Those guys are going to demand a lot of targets, a lot of receptions, and both of these guys do get targeted more than 100 times last season. So, looking at the defense, which, as we mentioned, not a very impressive unit last year, but there are a few standout players here. We'll mention first, we'll look at the linebackers, because Seattle does run a 3-4, so most of their pass rushers are technically outside linebackers coming out of the 2-point stance. But two guys that really stood out last year, Uchenna Nwosu and Darrell Taylor. Each of these guys with 9.5 sacks. Nwosu has 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, 4 pass deflections, and 26 quarterback hits, while Darrell Taylor does accumulate 4 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery, 1 pass deflection, and 13 quarterback hits. Now looking at the secondary, two guys who stand out here as well. Tariq Woolen starts all 17 games, 6 interceptions, takes 1 back for a touchdown, 3 fumble recoveries, and a tackle for a loss, as well as Quandre Diggs starts all 17 games as well, 4 interceptions, runs him back for a total of 70 yards despite no touchdowns, 7 pass deflections, 1 forced fumble, tackle for a loss, and a quarterback hit. And as a matter of fact, Diggs, Woolen, Geno Smith, and kicker Jason Myers all earned Pro Bowl honors, so congratulations to those gentlemen, well deserved. Now looking at the 2023 Seahawks offseason, what are they going to do to try to put themselves over the top for 2023? So San Francisco was the best team in the NFC West in 2022, but Seattle really could give them a run for their money here if they play their cards right in the offseason. They were a playoff contender last year, and while they were certainly more of a team playing to its potential last year as opposed to a loaded roster just personnel-wise, I guess I'm trying to say Seattle made the most of what they had last year, but if they want to take that next step, they're going to need to inject some more talent into this roster. But if they do, they could absolutely take the NFC West crown this season and could potentially go further. So we'll start out here with the players that Seattle lost. And they lose a few notable pieces, mostly on the defense here. They lose defensive lineman Poona Ford to the Buffalo Bills, defensive lineman Shelby Harris to the Cleveland Browns, safety Ryan Neal to the Tampa Bay Bucks, linebacker Cody Barton to the Washington Commanders, then another pair of defensive linemen, Quentin Jefferson and Al Woods, departing to the New York Jets. So definitely would seem that Seattle has the most needs, or they lost the most, I suppose I should say, on the defensive line. And while they do lose another piece in the secondary and another piece at linebacker, really not too much that they'll need to recuperate here. Really don't lose anything of note on their offense. They do lose Marquise Goodwin, who was their number 3 receiver, and Rashad Penny, who was a backup running back to Kenneth Walker, but they'll certainly be in a good position going forward as we see with their additions. So who do the Seattle Seahawks bring in for 2023? They start out by bringing in defensive lineman Draymond Jones from the Denver Broncos. Then they follow that up by signing Julian Love, safety from the New York Giants. He could step in right away as a replacement for Ryan Neal. They also sign center from the Detroit Lions, Evan Brown, who will definitely help their offensive line. Then they sign Jerron Reed, another defensive lineman from the Green Bay Packers. And they bring back a familiar veteran face in Bobby Wagner, formerly of that Legion of Boom defense. Went away to Los Angeles for a bit, but he's back now, and honestly, he could be a key factor in leading the Seattle Seahawks defense back to glory. And also have to give a shout out to Devin Bush, another linebacker coming from the Pittsburgh Steelers, He'll definitely be a key piece as he's only age 25. Pete Carroll could still absolutely develop him into a better player. And even Mario Edwards Jr. coming over from the Tennessee Titans, yet another defensive lineman. So Seattle does add 3 defensive linemen here, 2 linebackers, a safety, and a center. So really they address all of their needs. They could maybe use a little more help on the defensive line still, but in fact they actually upgrade their offensive line coming out of free agency. And we haven't even gotten to the draft yet. And boy, what a draft for the Seattle Seahawks. So let's take a look at that. I say that because Seattle does end up with the 5th overall selection by way of that Russell Wilson trade with Denver. And they had several options for this 5th overall selection, but they ultimately go with cornerback Devin Witherspoon out of Illinois, which is a fantastic pick. I'm really not going to hold that against them because he could be somebody who steps onto the field right away and becomes a #1 cornerback for them and could be a key piece in this defense going forward. If Pete Carroll wants to try to rebuild the Legion of Boom and go for that Super Bowl this season or next season, this is the way you do it. And yeah, there were some other talented players on the board here. Could have taken Jalen Carter, the defensive lineman out of Georgia, who definitely would have helped their defensive line, as it is a weakness right now for them. They could have taken Tyree Wilson as another edge rusher. Suppose he would have been an outside linebacker in Seattle's scheme. They could have even taken another corner like Christian Gonzalez, or perhaps even a quarterback, but I do believe that Pete Carroll is all in on the idea of trying to win right now with Geno Smith at quarterback and wants to just build this roster out around him. So taking a rookie quarterback here wouldn't have really made much sense, especially considering that 3 went with the first 4 picks. So you had Bryce Young go first, CJ Stroud second, and then Anthony Richardson fourth. So besides Will Anderson going third to the Houston Texans, Seattle had their pick of pretty much any non-quarterback in this draft class, and they go with Devin Witherspoon, and I really can't hold that against them. But the fun's not over yet, though, because they do still have another first-round pick at the 20th overall selection, and they take wide receiver Jackson Smith and Jigba. And he is somebody who could play the slot receiver role very, very well and could immediately step in and be a #3 receiver for them behind Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Then moving down here, they do have a pair of second-round picks as well. They have Derek Hall, who is listed as an edge rusher here, but he'll most likely be an outside linebacker for the Seattle Seahawks. And then they also have Zach Charbonnet, running back out of UCLA, who I really like this pick. He's somebody who I thought, whatever team he went to, he could have been perhaps a future bell cow 3-down style running back, but he goes to Seattle, who already has Kenneth Walker III in place, so between the two of them, they could have a really potent 1-2 punch. Then on day 3, they address their trenches here in round 4, and really in round 5 as well, though Mike Morris will probably be more of a linebacker, before taking a couple flyers here at the end of the draft on another safety and another running back. So overall, really impressed with this draft class from the Seattle Seahawks. Would have liked to have seen them address the trenches a little bit more, but I am a fan of the players that they selected, and that's ultimately what matters. You'd rather have a good player at a position you don't necessarily need, as opposed to a player who isn't ideal but is at a position of need. You always want to take talent over need, in my opinion. So let's see how Seattle puts this all together. Now, starting at quarterback, we know this is Geno Smith's job. Drew Lock still remains as the backup coming over in that Russell Wilson trade, but so long as Geno's upright, this is firmly his team. And looking at this running back room, clear pecking order here, we have the 1-2 punch of the sophomore Kenneth Walker and the rookie Zach Charbonnet. Very much looking forward to seeing this duo in action. I think Pete Carroll's going to have a lot of fun utilizing both of these guys. They're going to bounce off of each other, keep each other fresh, and really just be a lot of fun to watch every Sunday. Then we do still have DJ Dallas on a rookie deal behind them, and Kenny McIntosh, the rookie 7th round pick. Then at tight end, we do have the duo of Noah Fant and Will Dissly. Nothing really extraordinary here, but don't necessarily need it to be. Noah Fant does have talent that has been kind of gone underutilized at the National Football League, and Will Dissly's always been a solid veteran for Seattle, so these guys can fill in nicely for this roster. But looking now at the wide receiver position, and as we mentioned, very solid 1-2-3 punch here between DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Absolutely love the idea of all three of these guys on the field. Paired with this running back duo, really gives Geno Smith a lot of weapons and toys to work with on this offense. This could really be a fun unit to watch, but the unfortunate part is this offensive line, and definitely leaves a lot to be desired here. So I would say that this is firmly a bottom 5 offensive line in the National Football League, if not perhaps even a bottom 3 unit, because there really isn't too much to be encouraged about as of right now, though there is some upside, I will say. They do have 2 sophomore players at the tackle positions, Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, and while they didn't have fantastic rookie seasons, especially Charles Cross considering he was a top 10 pick, they're still very young, still a lot of time. If these guys can just develop and get better, if Pete Carroll and his staff can make these guys play to their potential, that would go a long way. Then they do have Evan Brown at the center position, the veteran acquisition. If he could help stabilize some things in the interior of this offensive line, that would go a long way as well. Then they also have Damian Lewis and Phil Hayes, 2 mid-round draft picks from a few years back, manning the starting guard positions. But behind them, they have 2 rookies here, Anthony Bradford and Watiima, hope I'm pronouncing that young man's name correctly, both on the interior of the offensive line, selected in the 4th and 5th round this year respectively. And then 3rd-year man Stone Forsythe at, looks like as their primary swing tackle, though they do still have Jake Curhan on the other side. But overall, not overly enthusiastic about this offensive line, but if Seattle can really have these guys just play to their potential and just provide a serviceable offensive line to provide Geno Smith adequate time to run the plays that Pete Carroll has in mind, just get the ball into the hands of these weapons. That's going to be the goal of this offense because they just have so many of them. I'd say really you have 5 absolute difference makers here in DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Kenneth Walker, and Zach Charbonnet. Just need Geno to distribute the football to those guys, and this offense should be in a fantastic spot for success. Then looking at this defense, and this defense is pretty similar to the offense in a lot of ways because I do think they have a lot of playmakers on this defense, but not really many in the trenches. So again, much like with the offensive line, I would say this defensive line is absolutely a bottom 5 unit in the National Football League, perhaps even a bottom 3 unit. Not really too much I'm overly enthusiastic about here. Their best player on the defensive line is probably Draymond Jones of the Denver Broncos, who they just added, but really not too much else going on here. They have Mario Edwards Jr. starting opposite of him with Jerron Reed at the nose tackle position. They do have a couple mid-round picks here as well, rotating in Cameron Young, 4th round selection from this year, and Mike Morris, a 5th round selection from this year. That being said though, still not very enthusiastic about this unit. I don't have a lot of faith that these guys are going to be highly successful against either the run or the pass, and if they're going up against a team with a strong offensive line especially, I just don't see how Seattle's getting a lot of pressure on the quarterback. That being said though, Seattle does run a 3-4, so let's see what they have at the linebacker position because perhaps they could have some difference makers here. And of course, they do have Uchenna Nwosu at the outside linebacker position. He had 9.5 sacks last season, so perhaps he could step things up this year and continue getting to the quarterback consistently. And they do have Boye Mafi at the other outside linebacker position. And he was their second round selection last year, so still very young, still very much has a lot of upside. And they even have two more second round picks of recent memory rotating in behind them. Darrell Taylor, second round pick from 2020, and this year's second round pick, Derek Hall. But then even looking at the inside linebacker position, we have the duo of Jordan Brooks, first round pick from 2020, alongside Bobby Wagner returning to the fold. So definitely encouraged about that duo. And then they do have Devin Bush rotating in as well. So definitely feel a lot better about this linebacker position. I would say this is definitely one of the better units in the National Football League. Although they're going to need to be, because this defensive line is not going to be doing them any favors going up against opposing offensive lines. Then finally, looking at the secondary, and as a whole, I would say this is a pretty average secondary. However, that being said, they do have a lot of highs on the secondary. They have a lot of key playmakers here. So they do have Jamal Adams at the strong safety, paired next to Quandre Diggs at the free safety. And I'm very much a fan of this starting duo here. And they even have Julian Love and sixth round pick Jarek Reed II rotating in. I'm a fan of that at safety. And then looking at the cornerback position, not really a ton going on here. However, they do have Devin Witherspoon, as we know. And he's definitely going to be the key cog in this secondary. They have him listed as a nickel cornerback here, but I highly expect him to be going up against opposing teams' number one receiver. So they match up against the San Francisco 49ers. You're probably putting him on Deebo Samuel, or perhaps even Brandon Ayuk. Or it could be George Kittle, really whoever you want him on, because they have so many weapons. But they go up against the Los Angeles Rams, you put him on Cooper Kupp. Go up against the Philadelphia Eagles, probably put him on either A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith. I do think it is worth noting, though, that head coach Pete Carroll has said Jamal Adams will miss the first week of the regular season due to injury, and Devin Witherspoon sounds like is doubtful for that first game as well. So with both of those guys in the lineup, I would say this is an average secondary because they really don't have much at the cornerback position besides Devin Witherspoon. However, if you take Jamal Adams and Devin Witherspoon out of the equation, the secondary becomes very vulnerable. And luckily for them, they're playing the Los Angeles Rams week 1, and Cooper Kupp is also dealing with his own injury concerns. So if Cooper Kupp misses that game, maybe not Los Angeles, maybe Seattle catches a bit of a break. But if a healthy Cooper Kupp were in the lineup, I would certainly be worried if I were the Seattle Seahawks. That being said, let's look at this 2023 Seahawks schedule. And I do have the Seahawks finishing with a 12-5 record in my projections, although that is highly subjective. I know even some Seahawks fans don't have the Seahawks projected to finish that well, so let's really break this down. Week 1 against the Los Angeles Rams, I do think this is a decisive victory for Seattle, even without those players in the secondary. Los Angeles is really struggling right now. And while, yes, they do still have Sean McVay as their head coach, the Seahawks still have Pete Carroll as their head coach despite their injuries. I do like the Seahawks' chances in this game. Week 2 against Detroit, I will give this one to Detroit. I like the matchup of Detroit's offensive line versus Seattle's defensive line. I've mentioned that in a few videos now. And especially if Detroit's coming off of a loss week 1 against Kansas City on Thursday night. They're going to have 10 days of prep here for this week 2 matchup, while Seattle's just going to have a week. Seattle will be riding high off of victory and they'll be going on the road, whereas Detroit will be coming back home and have a little extra time to rest up. Like Detroit in this one. But then week 3, Seattle should take advantage of the rookie quarterback Bryce Young. Think they win this one. Then they play a Monday night game in week 4 against the New York Giants, and this could definitely be a very competitive matchup, but do give the slight edge to the Seahawks here. Then they have an early bye in week 5, and coming out of that, they play the Cincinnati Bengals. And I do give the edge to the Seattle Seahawks here. I think Pete Carroll, with 2 weeks of prep time, will be able to find a winning game plan for the Cincinnati Bengals roster. The secondary should be healthy for the Seahawks by this point, ideally. So if you have Devin Witherspoon and Jamal Adams healthy, beside Quandre Diggs back there, they could at least slow down that trio of Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. At least try to slow them down better than most teams could. So I do give the edge to the Seahawks here, although could certainly give this to the Bengals as well. We can tinker around with this once we get to the end of the schedule. Week 7 over the Cardinals, don't really think that's too much to debate there. Week 8 against the Browns, I do give this one to the Browns. Again, I love what the Browns have in the trenches, much like with Detroit, and I think they're really going to just take advantage of the Seattle Seahawks roster. And on the flip side, having a player like Myles Garrett just attack the Seattle Seahawks offensive line, not excited about that. They're going to force Geno into some bad decisions. Week 9 against the Baltimore Ravens. I gave this one to Seattle, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Baltimore wins this game. I honestly have more of a consideration giving this matchup to Baltimore than I do giving this one to Cincinnati up here. I definitely think out of either of these two, though, Seattle probably loses one of them, so we can circle back. Week 10 against the Washington Commanders. Do like Seattle here. Same with Week 11 against the Rams, honestly. I know I am projecting a sweep of the Los Angeles Rams, considering the Rams are coming off of their bye as well, but I do believe Seattle is just a better team than Los Angeles as of right now. This game could certainly be a very close matchup, but slight edge to the Seahawks here. Then they come back on a short week against the San Francisco 49ers on Thanksgiving in the primetime game, and I do think San Francisco is going to just firmly put their foot on the gas for this division here in Week 12. They then follow it up with another Thursday night matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, and I give this one to Seattle as well, although wouldn't be surprised if Dallas won this game here as well. Definitely a lot of difficult matchups here in November for these competitive teams, because then they play San Francisco again, and I do project a sweep of San Francisco here. Although it is entirely possible, say Seattle splits these two matchups with San Francisco, then follows it up by losing to Dallas here. Perhaps even one of these AFC North teams. And I do have them defeating the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 15, largely because Seattle is coming off of a loss here against San Francisco, and Philadelphia is coming off of a road game against the Dallas Cowboys. So the Eagles are in the midst of a really tough stretch. They're actually coming out of a really tough stretch, staying on the road, going from Texas to Seattle, even further away from home. I think Seattle just gets a nice victory here. This is one of those ones where maybe the Eagles just don't play their best brand of football, and Seattle's just prepared for them. Then Week 16 against the Tennessee Titans. I think these two teams match up pretty well. Tennessee's another team that's not very strong in the trenches, but has great coaching. I do believe Seattle just has the superior talent, though. I know Titans have Derrick Henry and now DeAndre Hopkins. Seattle does have a lot of playmakers on offense as well, though, and they do have playmakers on the defensive side of the football additionally. Granted, we haven't gone through Tennessee's roster yet either. Tennessee is one of the 3 teams we still have yet to talk about, but do like Seattle here. Week 17 against Pittsburgh. I do think Pittsburgh is going to be too much for Seattle. Pittsburgh just has a very well-rounded roster, whereas Seattle's roster is definitely more focused on the skill positions, it would seem, and on defense, they're more focused on the back 7. Whereas with Pittsburgh, I believe their roster really doesn't have one screaming out weakness, not one gaping hole on their roster. So I give the edge to Pittsburgh here, but Seattle does get the Week 18 victory over the Arizona Cardinals. So let's do a little bit of tinkering around here. let's say that Seattle's able to win. We'll give them one of these matchups over the 49ers, and then hypothetically say they lose to Dallas, and we can even give them another loss to, say, the Baltimore Ravens. And that would put them at a record of 11 and 6, still with the 6th seed in the NFC playoffs. In fact, they could also lose to the Cincinnati Bengals and finish with a 10 and 7 record, and it really wouldn't change a thing. They would still be the 6th seed. Actually, it would knock them down. Would that knock them down? So, hold on, let's go back a little bit. We give them these victories again. Originally, I had them at 12 and 5, and they were okay. They were still the 6th seed. I know this would actually end up switching the Eagles and Cowboys in the NFC East if Seattle were to lose to the Cowboys but beat the Eagles. So Seattle could potentially decide that NFC East whether they realize it or not. Right now, though, we'll give Seattle victory over one of these San Francisco games, and we can give them losses to both of these AFC North teams, the Bengals and the Ravens. And that would put them at 11 and 6, and it would still have them at the 6th seed in the NFC playoffs. Still have them matched up with Detroit in the wild card round. So really, the NFC wild card is going to be largely set in stone here if things go accordingly. Because I do believe one of these two NFC East teams will secure the 5th seed with maybe not necessarily a 13 and 4 record, but I don't believe they'll be too far down here where Seattle's going to be able to leapfrog them very easily, unless they do just defeat the Eagles and the Cowboys. So we'll put it back to how things originally were here so we don't mess up the other team's standings, but then we can look ahead to 2023 playoffs because Seattle is one of the teams that are going to make the playoff picture in the NFC, and I firmly believe that. I don't think Seattle is going to miss the playoffs here. The NFC is just so wide open. The 7 teams I have making the NFC playoffs are the Eagles, Cowboys, 49ers, Seahawks, Lions, Vikings, and Bucks. And I know there's definitely some debate as to who could win that NFC South. Could very well be any of these 4 teams, honestly. And we still have yet to go through Tampa Bay's roster, so my prediction on that could certainly change. But looking at the rest of this NFC, who else is really going to make it? I don't see any of these teams from the South making it as a wild card. Perhaps Green Bay could sneak into the playoffs. Maybe the New York Giants get back in. A very outside chance the Los Angeles Rams, although as good of a coach as Sean McVay is, I think he will get the record better than it probably deserves to be this season. I don't know if it's going to be enough for them to make the playoffs, but then again, Seattle was a team that was counted out and left for dead last season, and they made the playoffs. So it's entirely possible Los Angeles could just shock everybody this year. But looking at the playoffs, I do project Seattle gets a rematch of Week 2 against Detroit in the first round. And while I did give Detroit the edge in Week 2, I think Seattle takes it here. I think they do get the better of them in the rematch. Pete Carroll is going to make sure these guys get up for this game. Seattle's going to come into this game prepared. Seattle was in the playoffs last year while Detroit wasn't, and I know it's an any given Sunday league in the National Football League. A lot of these guys remember how it felt to lose to the 49ers last year. And Seattle only got better as a team, and while I do like Detroit's roster, I don't think it's as good as San Francisco's last year. I don't think that's very controversial. So project a nice little upset here in the first round. Seattle getting to go on to the divisional round. But in the divisional round, they face the Philadelphia Eagles at Lincoln Financial Field. And as spicy as it would be to project Seattle advancing to the NFC Championship, the Eagles are just going to eat this team alive in the trenches. I'm sorry. And they will get the better of them this go around. As opposed to the regular season matchup where the Eagles are coming off of a really tough road stretch going from Texas to Seattle. This time they'll be sitting on their couch at home in the wild card round while Seattle has to go to Detroit and play a tough Lions team. So Seattle's season will end in the divisional round here, but do believe that'll be very much seen as a success for Seattle this season. Ideally, they end up taking this NFC West crown, although San Francisco does kind of have that on lock until proven otherwise at the moment. So finally, before we wrap up, we'll take a look at this Seattle Seahawks salary cap situation. And really, they have kind of a bargain here with Geno Smith. As funny as that is, all things considered, if he can maintain that level of play from last year. If they could get a quarterback who's throwing 4,300 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions at a sub $30 million cap hit spread out over these 3 years, you really can't ask for much more than that. That is fantastic. Then at the running back position, dynamic duo of Walker and Charbonnet, both on rookie contracts. Pretty much no money invested there. At wide receiver, they have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett signed for the next 3 seasons. Jackson Smith and Jigba for the next 4, plus a potential 5th-year option. Down at tight end, Noah Fant is in a contract year, but Noah Fant really isn't one of the key players on this offense at the moment. They could probably find some better value there. And then they do still have Will Dissly signed for the next 2 seasons. So knowing Pete Carroll, he might just go with the next man up mentality and say, you know what, Will Dissly, you're our starting tight end in 2024. Then looking at the offensive line, they do have the luxury of at least not having a lot of money invested here. So while this offensive line is one of the weaker units in the National Football League, it's not as if they have a ton of money tied up into this unit. So it does still allow them flexibility to spend at other positions. And they do have Charlie Cross on a rookie deal for another 3 years, plus a potential option, as well as Abraham Lucas at their opposite tackle. And then looking at the defensive line, they did just sign Draymond Jones this offseason. He's really the only noticeable cap hit here, though, on the defensive line. They have Brian Money and Jerron Reed signed to a decent cap hit here. But even a player who's starting like Mario Edwards, only just making a little bit over $1 million this season. So not really a lot invested on this defensive line. And that's really reflective of the talent on this defensive line, though. And that's okay, much like with the offensive line. It allows them to spend money elsewhere on positions where they do have the talent. So looking at the linebacker position, Uchenna Nwosu making the big money here over the next 4 years, well deserved. Bobby Wagner on a 1-year flyer. He's at age 33, so that's entirely expected. Jordan Brooks and Devin Bush also on 1-year deals, so perhaps Seattle's going to need to invest something into this linebacker position after this season if they lose a few of these guys without having a replacement really lined up. But then looking at the secondary, they have their duo of Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs signed for the next 2 seasons, Jamal Adams for the next 3, and of course Devin Witherspoon for the next 4, plus a 5th-year option. So when all said and done, Seattle actually has some cap room to play with this year, although they are projected to be pinned right up against the cap the next 2 seasons. The good news is, though, really none of their star players are coming up on contract years. Really all the players who are free agents after this year are either on the wrong side of 30 or just replaceable. So I like the future outlook for Seattle here. And we won't go through their draft picks because they don't really have anything of note. Not getting any surprise top 5 picks this season. Sorry, Seahawks fans, but they essentially just have all of their own selections. So they can really just continue to build this thing up. So, love to hear from the 12th man out there. How do you feel Seattle does this year? Can they win the NFC West crown? How far are they going to go in the playoffs? Will Geno Smith be able to maintain his production from last season? And which of these rookies are you the most excited about? Is it Devin Witherspoon, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zach Charbonnet, or maybe somebody else? Let me know down in the comments, and we'll keep this thing rolling as we really just have 3 teams left: the Tampa Bay Bucks, Tennessee Titans, and Washington Commanders. So look forward to talking to you guys next time regarding Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Bucks.